The dust settled around the weathered stagecoach as it creaked to a halt outside Millfield's only boarding house. Through the grimy window, Catherine Hayes pressed her palm against her swollen belly, feeling the child kick restlessly within. The whispers had followed her all the way from Kansas City. Broken woman, damaged goods, too far gone for any decent man's love. At 23, widowed and carrying her late husband's child, she had become the subject of hushed conversations and pitying glances. The Colorado Territory promised a fresh start, a place where her past couldn't define her future. The boarding house proprietor, Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, emerged with flour-dusted hands and a cautious smile. Catherine had written ahead, explaining her situation in careful, measured words that revealed nothing of the bruises that had finally healed or the nights she'd spent listening for footsteps that would never come again. The older woman's eyes lingered on Catherine's condition with maternal concern, taking in the fine bones of her face and the way she held herself, proud despite everything. "You must be Mrs. Hayes," Eleanor said warmly, though Catherine caught the slight hesitation that preceded the greeting. Even here, 300 miles from her old life, she remained an object of curiosity and judgment. The main street of Millfield stretched before them like a promise written in dust and determination. Wooden storefronts lined the thoroughfare, their painted signs faded by the relentless Colorado sun, while horses tied to hitching posts stamped impatiently in the afternoon heat. Cowboys and settlers moved with purpose between the general store, the saloon, and the small church that sat like a white beacon at the end of the street. Catherine observed it all with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read danger in the smallest details. This town would be her sanctuary or her prison, depending on how quickly the stories followed her west. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, and Catherine placed both hands protectively over her belly as she stepped down from the stagecoach. The driver, a gruff man named Jake Morrison, handled her single trunk with surprising gentleness, his weathered face softening when he noticed her condition. "You take care of yourself now, Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat with genuine concern. "This here's a good town, full of decent folk who mind their own business." His words carried the weight of experience, as if he'd transported many souls seeking redemption in the vast emptiness of the frontier. Mrs. Whitman led her through the boarding house's modest lobby, past a crackling fireplace and well-worn furniture that spoke of countless stories and temporary homes. The smell of fresh bread and coffee filled the air, mixing with the scent of sage that drifted through open windows on the evening breeze. Catherine's room was small but clean, with a window facing west toward the mountains that rose like purple sentinels against the sky. "Dinner's at 6, Eleanor said kindly, pausing at the doorway. "The other boarders are good people, a school teacher, a bank clerk, and a young couple saving for their own homestead. They'll treat you with respect." As the door closed behind Mrs. Whitman, Catherine sank onto the narrow bed and allowed herself the luxury of tears she'd held back during the long journey. The weight of starting over pressed against her chest like a physical thing, mixing hope with the bone-deep fear that her past would always define her. Through her window, she could see the edge of town where the buildings gave way to endless grassland, dotted with cattle, and the occasional rider moving slowly across the landscape. The vastness both terrified and comforted her. Out there, a woman could disappear into the horizon and emerge as someone entirely new. Her fingers traced the simple gold band she still wore, a habit born of protection rather than sentiment. Thomas Hayes had been many things, charming, successful, cruel, but he was gone now, lost to a fever that had taken him as suddenly as his fists had taken her peace. The child she carried was innocent of his father's sins, deserving of a life free from the shadows that had defined Catherine's marriage. She had sold everything of value, gathered her meager savings, and bought passage to a place where widows weren't automatically assumed to be desperate or available. The sound of voices drifted up from the dining room below, mixing with the clatter of dishes and the scrape of chairs against wooden floors. Soon she would have to go downstairs, introduce herself to strangers, and begin the delicate dance of building a new identity. Catherine Rose Whitfield, she had decided during the journey, using her maiden name and middle name to create someone fresh, someone untainted by the whispers that had followed Catherine Hayes. The baby would grow up knowing only this version of their mother, strong and independent and worthy of love. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts, followed by Eleanor's gentle voice announcing dinner. Catherine rose slowly, smoothing her dark blue dress over her belly and checking her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. Her green eyes still held shadows of old fears, but there was something new there too, a flicker of determination that hadn't existed 6 months ago. The woman looking back at her was no longer the frightened wife who had jumped at shadows and made excuses for bruises. As she prepared to face her new neighbors, Catherine whispered a prayer to the empty room, asking not for love or happiness, but simply for peace. The frontier had a way of stripping people down to their essential selves, burning away the unnecessary and revealing what truly mattered. Tomorrow she would begin looking for work, perhaps as a seamstress or helping in one of the town's businesses. Tonight she would take the first step toward becoming the woman she was meant to be, not broken, not damaged, but simply human and deserving of a chance at redemption. The dining room hummed with quiet conversation as Catherine descended the stairs, her hand trailing along the polished banister for support. 3 faces looked up expectantly. Mary Sullivan, the schoolteacher with kind eyes and prematurely grey hair, Harold Peterson, the bank clerk, whose nervous energy seemed barely contained, and the young couple, Emma and David Crawford, who watched her with the open curiosity of people still discovering life's possibilities. Eleanor Whitman bustled around the table, serving generous portions of beef stew and fresh cornbread, while making introductions with practiced ease. Catherine took her seat carefully, hyper-aware of how her condition drew glances, both sympathetic and curious. "Mrs. Whitfield is new to our little community," Eleanor announced, using Catherine's chosen name with seamless confidence. The warmth in her voice suggested she understood the importance of fresh starts and unquestioned acceptance. Mary Sullivan immediately launched into enthusiastic descriptions of the town's virtues: the new school building, the upcoming harvest festival, the growing library that occupied one corner of the general store. Emma Crawford chimed in with details about the best places to shop and the friendliest neighbors, her young face glowing with the optimism of someone who had never known real hardship. Harold Peterson nodded along politely, though his attention seemed divided between the conversation and a stack of papers he'd brought to dinner. Through the dining room window, Catherine noticed a lone rider passing slowly down the main street, his silhouette distinct against the fading light. Unlike the other cowboys she'd observed, this man sat his horse with a stillness that spoke of deep patience and careful observation. He was tall, broad-shouldered beneath a worn leather coat, with dark hair visible beneath his hat brim. Something about his deliberate pace and the way he seemed to take in everything, while appearing to notice nothing, caught her attention. "That's Jesse McCann," Eleanor said, following her gaze. "Runs the largest cattle ranch in the county, about 5 miles north of town." Mary Sullivan's expression grew thoughtful as she watched the rider disappear into the gathering dusk. "Poor man's been through considerable hardship," she said quietly, her teacher's instinct for seeing beyond surface appearances evident in her tone. Emma Crawford leaned forward eagerly, clearly sensing a story worth hearing. "Lost his wife and young son in a typhoid outbreak 3 years back," Mary continued, her voice dropping to a respectful whisper. "Haven't heard him speak more than a dozen words since then, but he's generous to families in need and always pays his bills on time." Harold Peterson nodded confirmation, adding that Jesse McCann's ranch was one of the bank's most reliable accounts, despite his personal tragedies. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Catherine found herself thinking about the silent rancher and the weight of loss that seemed to follow him like a shadow. She understood the way grief could steal a person's voice, how words became unnecessary when the world had already said too much. Emma Crawford was describing the town's upcoming social events, barn dances, church suppers, and community gatherings designed to bring neighbors together when Catherine felt a familiar tightening in her back. The baby was growing restless, responding perhaps to her own tension and the effort of maintaining pleasant conversation with strangers. Mrs. Whitman noticed her discomfort immediately, maternal instincts honed by years of caring for others. "Perhaps you'd like to retire early tonight, dear," she suggested gently, beginning to clear Catherine's barely touched plate. The other boarders murmured understanding words, Mary Sullivan offering to save her a portion of the apple pie that would be served for dessert. Catherine accepted their kindness gratefully, excusing herself with promises to join them for breakfast and learn more about opportunities for employment in town. Back in her room, Catherine stood at the window watching the last light fade from the western sky, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. The town below was settling into evening routines, lamps being lit in windows, the last customers leaving the general store, couples walking slowly arm in arm down the boardwalks. It was peaceful in a way she'd almost forgotten existed, free from the tension that had defined her married life. The baby kicked gently, as if responding to her sense of calm, and Catherine found herself humming a lullaby her own mother had sung years ago. A movement in the street below caught her attention, and she saw the silent rancher returning, his horse moving at the same measured pace she'd observed earlier. "Jesse McCann," she repeated mentally, filing away the details Mary Sullivan had shared about his losses and his reputation for quiet generosity. There was something compelling about a man who chose silence over empty words, who let his actions speak for his character. As she watched, he glanced up toward the boarding house windows, and for a brief moment, Catherine thought their eyes met across the distance and gathering darkness. The next morning brought the sound of hammering from somewhere near the church, mixing with the usual sounds of a town awakening to another day. Catherine dressed carefully in her second-best dress, a deep green that complemented her eyes and accommodated her expanding figure with practical elegance. Downstairs, Eleanor Whitman was already bustling around the kitchen, preparing breakfast and organizing her day with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing multiple responsibilities. "There's been some excitement this morning," she announced as Catherine entered the dining room. "Seems we're getting a new doctor, and the town council's asked Jesse McCann to oversee repairs to the church roof." The irony wasn't lost on Catherine that the silent rancher had been chosen to manage a project that would require coordination and communication with multiple townspeople. Mary Sullivan, already seated with her morning coffee, explained that Jesse's reputation for reliability and fair dealing made him the obvious choice, despite his preference for solitude. "He'll get the job done right," she said with confidence, "even if he does it without saying more than absolutely necessary." Catherine found herself curious about how a man who avoided conversation would handle such a public responsibility, and whether the project might offer glimpses into the person he'd been before grief changed him. 3 weeks into her new life, Catherine had established a routine that gave structure to her days and purpose to her growing restlessness. She'd found work helping Mrs. Whitman with the boarding house accounts and doing intricate needlework for the town's wealthier families, her skilled fingers creating delicate embroidery that commanded surprising prices. The work allowed her to contribute to her room and board, while building a small nest egg for when the baby arrived. Each morning she would sit in the boarding house parlor with her sewing, watching the town wake up through the lace-curtained windows. It was during one of these quiet mornings that she witnessed Jesse McCann's first real challenge with the church repair project. The problem began when a wagon loaded with lumber overturned at the corner of Main and Church Streets, spilling boards across the intersection and blocking traffic in both directions. Catherine watched from her window as Jesse dismounted his horse and surveyed the situation with his characteristic stillness, while a growing crowd of onlookers offered conflicting advice about the best way to clear the mess. 2 of the lumber wagon drivers were arguing loudly about whose fault the accident had been, their voices carrying clearly across the morning air. Jesse stood apart from the chaos, his hands resting calmly on his hips as he assessed the scattered boards and the increasingly agitated crowd. What happened next surprised everyone, including Catherine. Without speaking, Jesse began organizing the cleanup with a series of subtle gestures and quiet words that somehow commanded immediate attention. He pointed to specific men, indicating which boards they should lift, and within minutes had established an efficient system for clearing the street. When the wagon drivers continued their heated argument, he simply walked between them and placed a firm hand on each man's shoulder, his steady gaze somehow diffusing their anger without a single word of reproach. Catherine found herself leaning forward, fascinated by this display of natural leadership that required no speeches or commands. The incident established Jesse's reputation as a problem solver, and over the following days, Catherine noticed how people began seeking him out for advice on matters both large and small. He would listen carefully to each concern, ask minimal questions, and offer solutions that invariably proved both practical and wise. From her vantage point in the boarding house parlor, Catherine watched him handle disputes between merchants, mediate disagreements about property lines, and coordinate the volunteer efforts for the church repairs. His silence, she began to realize, wasn't a symptom of broken spirits, but rather a tool he'd learned to use with remarkable effectiveness. Her own situation grew more complicated when a letter arrived from Kansas City, forwarded through a network of postal contacts she'd hoped to avoid. The envelope bore the distinctive handwriting of Margaret Townsend, her late husband's sister, who had made no secret of her disapproval of Catherine's decision to leave town. Inside, Margaret's words dripped with false concern and thinly veiled accusations about Catherine's unseemly haste in abandoning her husband's memory. The letter concluded with an ultimatum: return to Kansas City, where Margaret could properly supervise the raising of her brother's child or face social and legal consequences that would follow her wherever she tried to hide. Catherine's hands trembled as she folded the letter, her carefully constructed sense of security crumbling with each accusatory sentence. Margaret Townsend was a woman of considerable influence in Kansas City society, with the resources and connections to make good on her threats. The thought of returning to a place where she would be subjected to constant scrutiny and subtle cruelty made Catherine's stomach clench with more than pregnancy-related discomfort. She had escaped one form of control only to discover that her freedom remained conditional and precarious. That afternoon, seeking solitude to process her mounting anxiety, Catherine walked to the small cemetery behind the church, where the repair work was in full swing. She needed quiet space to think and plan, away from the well-meaning but observant eyes of her fellow boarders. The cemetery was peaceful, shaded by old cottonwood trees that rustled softly in the autumn breeze. She found a weathered bench near a family plot, marked with simple wooden crosses, and sat heavily, her hands automatically moving to cradle her belly as the baby stirred restlessly within. She was so lost in her troubled thoughts that she didn't notice Jesse McCann's approach until his shadow fell across the ground beside her. He stood quietly for a moment, his hat in his hands, and his dark eyes taking in her obvious distress, with concern that needed no words to communicate its sincerity. When Catherine looked up, startled by his presence, he gestured toward the bench in a wordless request for permission to sit. His nearness should have made her nervous. She'd learned to be wary of men who appeared suddenly when she was alone, but something about his patient stillness actually eased her anxiety. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the work crew repair the church roof, while the afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold. Jesse's presence was oddly soothing, perhaps because he made no demands for conversation or explanation of her obvious upset. When Catherine finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, she found herself sharing fears she hadn't intended to voice. "Sometimes the past follows you, no matter how far you run," she said, not looking at him, but somehow knowing he would understand the weight of those words. Jesse turned slightly toward her, his expression grave and thoughtful as he considered her statement. For a long moment, Catherine thought he wouldn't respond at all, and she began to regret her impulse to speak. Then, in a voice roughened by disuse but unmistakably gentle, he said, "Sometimes running isn't about escaping the past. It's about finding the strength to face it." His words hung in the air between them like a bridge across the silence that had defined both their recent lives, and Catherine felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight fear that had gripped her since Margaret's letter arrived. Margaret Townsend arrived in Millfield on a Tuesday morning, like a storm cloud in expensive clothing, her hired carriage raising dust clouds that seemed to announce her displeasure with the entire frontier existence. Catherine watched from her window as the formidable woman emerged, her black silk dress and elaborate hat completely unsuited to the practical rhythms of small-town life. Behind her came a thin man in a city suit, who could only be a lawyer, his leather satchel suggesting legal documents and ultimatums. Catherine's carefully rebuilt world suddenly felt as fragile as spun glass, ready to shatter at the first harsh word. The confrontation came within hours, staged in the boarding house parlor with Mrs. Whitman, as an unwilling witness to Margaret's dramatic accusations and demands. "This unseemly charade has gone on long enough," Margaret declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. She painted Catherine as an unfit mother, whose mental instability and moral weakness made her incapable of raising a Hayes child properly. The lawyer produced documents claiming guardianship rights based on Catherine's alleged inability to provide proper care, their legal language designed to intimidate and overwhelm. Catherine felt the familiar paralysis of helplessness creeping over her, the same sensation that had defined her marriage. But something had changed during her weeks in Millfield, something that Margaret's threats couldn't quite touch. Catherine found her voice in a way she never had during her marriage, speaking with quiet dignity about her right to determine her own life and her child's future. "Thomas is gone," she said firmly, her hands protective over her belly. "His violence died with him, and I won't let it live again through you." Margaret's face flushed with outrage at this public revelation of family secrets, her carefully constructed narrative crumbling in the face of Catherine's unexpected strength. The sound of boots on the front porch interrupted the heated exchange, followed by Jesse McCann's familiar silhouette filling the doorway. He took in the scene with those careful eyes, noting Catherine's pale face and defensive posture, Margaret's theatrical indignation and the lawyer's predatory confidence. Without invitation, he stepped into the parlor and removed his hat with deliberate courtesy. "Ma'am," he said to Catherine, his voice carrying the same gentle strength she'd heard at the cemetery, "thought you might need some company." His presence shifted the entire dynamic of the room, introducing an element Margaret clearly hadn't anticipated. Margaret attempted to dismiss Jessie with the imperious manner she used on servants, but her city arrogance met immovable frontier practicality. "This is a private family matter," she announced, expecting immediate compliance with her wishes. Jessie's response was to pull out a chair for Catherine and help her sit, his actions speaking louder than any words about where his loyalties lay. "In Millfield, we don't leave pregnant ladies to face bullies alone," he said quietly, his tone conversational but his meaning unmistakable. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing that his intimidation tactics worked better without witnesses who refused to be intimidated. What followed was a masterclass in quiet strength, as Jessie methodically dismantled Margaret's position without raising his voice or making threats. He mentioned, almost casually, that he'd done business with several judges in the territorial courts and that he'd be happy to provide character references for Mrs. Whitfield. He observed that a woman capable of managing boarding house accounts and building a successful needlework business hardly seemed incapable of caring for herself and her child. When the lawyer began citing legal precedents, Jessie simply asked for the names of their local associates so he could verify their standing with the Territorial Bar Association. The turning point came when Jessie placed his hand gently on Catherine's shoulder and made an announcement that stunned everyone present. "Mrs. Whitfield has agreed to become my wife," he said with calm certainty, his words creating a new reality in the space between one breath and the next. "The wedding will be held as soon as the circuit preacher returns next month." Catherine's eyes widened in shock, but she saw the lifeline he was offering and the deeper truth beneath his protective lie. A married woman with a respected rancher's support would be nearly impossible for Margaret to challenge legally. Margaret's fury was magnificent to behold, but her lawyer was already calculating the reduced chances of success against a married couple with local standing and community support. The legal documents that had seemed so threatening an hour earlier now appeared flimsy and insufficient. After an hour of blustering and ultimatums that carried no real weight, Margaret and her lawyer retreated to their hired carriage, promising dire consequences that everyone knew would never materialize. The storm had passed, leaving behind only the settling dust of defeat. As the carriage disappeared down the main street, Catherine turned to Jessie with questions in her eyes and gratitude in her voice. "Why?" she asked simply, needing to understand what had motivated his extraordinary gesture. Jessie was quiet for a long moment, his gaze following the departing carriage before returning to her face. "Because broken doesn't mean worthless," he said finally, his words carrying the weight of personal experience. "Sometimes the broken pieces fit together better than they ever did when they were whole." The poetry in his simple statement took Catherine's breath away. Over the weeks that followed, their fictional engagement became something surprisingly real as they discovered how well their damaged hearts understood each other. Jessie's quiet strength provided the security Catherine had never known, while her gentle presence began to heal wounds he'd thought would never close. They were married on a crisp November morning, with the baby arriving 3 weeks later, a daughter they named Sarah Hope McCann. As Catherine nursed her child in the warmth of Jessie's protective love, she finally understood that being broken wasn't the end of her story, but simply the beginning of a stronger, more beautiful one. Sometimes the most profound love grows in the spaces between words, nurtured by understanding that needs no explanation and trust that asks for no promises beyond tomorrow.